Sonic, the heart of your system.
Hello, Briony here from Kit Guru. In this video, I'm taking a look at the AEROCOOL TOR Pro case. So Leo already took a look at the original TOR case, and the only thing I can really see similar about this case to the original is maybe the same choice of odd name, and also I think it uses the same fans as well. So this case here beside me is obviously a full tower size case, so it has loads and loads of space for lots of lovely cooling options and hardware and things. Full tower size does definitely give you more room to work in. It comes with a retail price of £88 here in the UK, and from what I can tell, it does look quite similar to a lot of cases that I normally review. It's a big black square box, but it also has a little bit of RGB and a little bit of tempered glass as well. I do quite like its little shiny feet though, and I think the size of the TOR Pro is probably what makes it stand out the most. This is a pretty big case. I'm used to seeing a lot of mid-tower size cases these days, so this one does definitely stand out for me just from how tall it is, basically. So this first half of the review, I'm just going to start off by talking about the case while it's empty, and then in the second half of the review, I'll get some components in it, and then we can talk more about the performance and sort of what it's like to build it and things. I'll start off by taking a look at the front of the case. So down the bottom you have got a little bit of subtle AEROCOOL branding. I do quite like that, as I don't like a case to be a bit too gaudy and have the name of the manufacturer all over the place. So that's the only little bit you're going to find on this case, and it is very, very subtle. Up the top is where you'll find a rather large front I/O, so there's plenty of options. You've got your typical power and reset button. You also get a little button that changes the RGB lighting as well. There's two USB 3 ports, two USB 2 ports. There's also a jack for microphone and a jack for a headphone as well. And also, rather strangely on this case, there is an empty slot where you'd expect a USB-C connector to be, but for some reason AEROCOOL have opted not to put it on this case. I did email them and ask them why this was, and apparently it's because in the UK market there isn't much demand for a case with a USB-C connector. I'm not really sure about that, to be honest, because I can imagine there's probably quite a few people out there that would like to see that on a case. You can of course maybe mod it in yourself afterwards, so the slot is there, you just have to buy the connector online. They are available quite easily, but for me I think it would have been a really nice feature on this case. I am slightly disappointed that AEROCOOL opted to leave it off. Maybe if you do buy the case, if you're in America or in another EU country, maybe they will come with a connector, but definitely in the UK you don't get it included with the case. I've now removed the front panel of the case. It does come off pretty easily. You just give it a quick tug and then it pretty much slides off. It's quite happy to come undone, unlike some cases where you can be pulling at them for 5-10 minutes and sweating and screaming. The TOR Pro is a little bit easier, a little more forgiving. What I don't like though is that the front I/O cables are actually tethered to the front panel, so that's really annoying because obviously it makes it a little bit more awkward when it comes to building in the case or trying to clean the fans or something later on. The three fans that come with the case, there's 3 RGB fans in the front here, and they are technically 140mm fans in the size of them, but they do have an RGB frame that runs around them, so the actual fan inside that frame is only 120mm, so you're getting the same amount of airflow as you would with 3 120 instead of 140 fans. The fans themselves though, I think they're probably going to look pretty cool with them lit up. I've never seen square RGB fans before, so I'm quite excited to see what they look like with all the RGB glowing and flashing and things. So also with the front of this case, I must say I'm slightly concerned about the airflow, because when it comes to the front panel, it's only got one slot of vents down sort of the left hand side. That does have a dust filter on as well, so that's going to restrict airflow further, and on this other side the tempered glass does kind of cover the other vent, so obviously that's not great for airflow, so it will be interesting to see how well this case performs. The tempered glass side panel on the TOR Pro is pretty easy to remove. It does come off with 4 thumb screws. There we go, now you're not getting any horrible reflections and can actually see inside the case. So taking a look on the inside, the first thing you probably notice is that the PSU shroud isn't at the bottom of the case, it's actually at the top. So the power supply is installed in the top of the case, and the PSU shroud itself has a load of holes in it, which to me seems very odd for hiding cables. It's obviously not going to work very well for trying to hide your cables, which is what you want a PSU shroud for, but it does mean that it can actually be used as an additional area to mount fans, so that's another place to add some cooling in this case. The full size of the case means that you can install up to a full E80X motherboard, so the standoffs do come pre-installed as well, which of course I do like as it does save a little bit of time when it comes to building. So yeah, a full-size tower case, you can fit a whole host of components in it basically. Around the back here you also get 9 PCIe slots, so I'm used to seeing 7 on a mid-tower size case. The extra height that comes from this case, you can have 9 PCIe slots, so if you want to have that crazy SLI you can do, or Wi-Fi cards, or I don't know, whatever else you want to put in a PCIe slot, loads of stuff you can do. So yeah, those are the nice sort of screw off ones. They don't come with thumb screws, but thankfully I hate snap off PCIe slots. You cut your hand on them, you lose them, like they're just really annoying. So these are kind of like slide out ones, and they do come off with like a screw as well. So yeah, all in all, plenty of options when it comes to hardware. When it comes to the cooling in the case, you do get a total of 4 of those RGB fans, and they are the AEROCOOL Edge 14 fans, and I did find them available for about £14 each. The fact that you get 4 of them included in the price of the case, so that's 56 quid just on fans, meaning that the actual chassis of the case you're only paying about £30 for. So to me that does seem like a pretty good deal. This is slightly more of a budget case, so the fact that you get 4 RGB fans included is pretty damn good. We're going to have to wait until I do sort of the final review and the performance testing things to see if they are actually worth £14 each. But in general, I do think that at the moment it seems like a pretty good deal. You also have space in this case for a whole host of other sort of cooling configurations if you wanted to. So you can add more of the fans that come with the case, or you can mix up and install lots of different sizes. The case has loads of different options when it comes to fan support. So you can have 4 120 fans in the front, you can have 3 140mm fans, or you can have 2 200mm fans in the front if you wanted to. The bottom of the case allows for space for 3 120 or 2 140mm fans. The rear of the case will take 2 120 or 2 140mm fans, and then the PSU shroud area will take 3 120mm fans or 2 140mm fans. The thing though with the PSU shroud, it does have those holes and things in, so you can mount fans onto them, and obviously there is going to be some airflow through out the side panel of the case, but with all the cables and power supply and thing installed, I don't know if those fans are really going to do much. They'll probably look nice if you put RGB fans there, but for airflow I can probably imagine that the cable is going to prevent most of that. You can obviously fit the relevant radiators into these spaces as well, so anywhere where you can fit fans you can also fit radiators. The thing with the front of this case is that if you're going to fit a 360 or 480mm radiator, you do have to mount it slightly off center, because the way that the PSU shroud connects onto the case, it does obstruct like some of the mounting holes that you'd use for radiator space, so they've kind of moved them across for the larger radiators. But to me, I just think that's going to look really odd. Maybe not from this side of the case, but if you're going to put RGB fans on that radiator, they're going to be off-center at the front, and I just don't think that's really going to be a very good look. I mean, if you're buying a tempered glass case, you obviously care about how it looks, and to me that does seem a little bit of an odd choice, really. On the bottom of this case is where you'll find the single included removable dust filter that comes with it, and what I must say, it's better than having no dust filter, and it is nice to see on a case because it obviously does keep the dust out. That's what it's meant to do. But with this case, it is a little bit basic. It attaches on with magnets. And personally, I do prefer those kind of slide out drawer ones because they're much easier to take out and clean and put back into place. Having a magnet dust filter on the bottom of the case is really quite awkward because now the case is empty, I still find it quite difficult to kind of get it back into place. When this case is full of components, it's going to be even worse. And you really want your dust filter cleaning process to be as easy as possible. I flipped this case around so we can take a little look at the rear view. That sounds really bad. Take a look at the back of the case. So around the back here, you can see that there's like a strip of vents that run across the top. So these are to allow airflow from those fans that you might mount on the PSU shroud. I do wonder once again, like how effective this will actually be, especially as you're going to have cables in the way and things. But I suppose it's better than having no air vents at all. This side panel comes off with 2 thumb screws. And then we can see inside the back of this case. So you can now see what's going on with this PSU shroud up the top here. We've definitely got a much more visible view. You can see that the power supply is going to go in sideways in this case. It doesn't really make much difference to the power supply, but maybe airflow is going to be a little bit restricted and it's not going to have a dust filter on it or anything like that. So with this PSU shroud, you've got the holes here, so you've got plenty of room to shove cables, but those cables that you do shove up there are going to be visible from the other side. So yeah, for me, for a PSU shroud, this just seems like such a strange design. Obviously you get maybe a bit more airflow, but I just want to hide cables somewhere. I need to hide the cables. This little bag here comes with the case. It is essentially the accessories bag. So you get a few cable ties that come with the case. You also get all the screws and things you're going to need for building. There's a controller in here that also controls the RGB lighting. So there's a button on the front of the case. There's also a controller for RGB lighting. And then you also get a little adapter cable for the RGB lighting as well, because the RGB lighting can be controlled also via the motherboard. And this adapter is quite a nice little thing to include with the case really, because it means that you can still use the motherboard RGB control even if you've got a motherboard that has a slightly different RGB header. They've allowed support for 2 different types of RGB headers on motherboards. The front I/O cables that are sort of running across the back here, you can see are neatly coated in a black plastic. I do definitely prefer this as it can make the final build look a lot neater. You're not trying to battle with a load of rainbow cables. Also, you will find that this case comes with an included fan controller. So the fan controller controls the RGB lighting and also controls the speed of the fans. It does have PWM control as well, and it can take up to 8 fans and up to 2 LED strips. Unfortunately though, you can't just plug any old fan into this controller. It has the connections, like a specific connection for the fans that come with the case. So you can't just buy some other manufacturer's RGB fans and expect them to work with the same controller. I think this is quite a nice little feature to get a fan controller that comes with the case, particularly as it does the lighting and the speed. But one thing I really hate is it is powered by a Molex connector, and I'm just like, why, AEROCOOL? Why? Just use a SATA connector. But I know it's a budget case and it is a nice feature that comes with it. There is one thing that disappoints me about the TOR Pro. So with this case, it has loads of different space for cooling options. You've got loads of different space for radiators, different fans. You can have an eATX motherboard. You can have a whole host of really large graphics cards and SLI if you wanted to. But you really don't have many storage options. So I know NVMe drives are obviously the way forward, but with a full tower size case, it's nice to have space for hard drives and SSDs, because this is a Pro case as well. So they're obviously aiming at a market with people that are going to put more expensive hardware in the case. I know Pro is probably just a name, but I mean, in a full tower size case, you want lots of space. That includes storage as well. But in this case, you can only have 2 3.5-inch drives or 2 2.5-inch SSDs, which isn't really that great. However, they do install on these little brackets, which are quite nifty. So you can take them out, install the drive, put them back in. It's definitely a little bit easier. But also, you can also obviously remove the brackets if you're not using them to make space for more cable management options. In this case, in general, at the moment, I haven't built in it, so I don't know what it's going to be like to cable manage. But guessing, it has, it's got 3 centimeters of clearance, so that's pretty good. And also, it does have this huge amount of space up the top here to just shove cables into. I'm slightly disappointed that the slots don't have rubber grommets on them, but fortunately, they're not sharp, and also they seem to be pretty well positioned as well. well. There's plenty of nice holes to get cables through to the front of the motherboard. I'd maybe like to see a few more places to thread cable ties through, but in general it seems pretty good to go. From what I've encountered so far, the overall build quality of the TOR Pro seems to be about bang on for a case at this particular price point. You can tell that maybe it is a slightly cheaper case, but the entire chassis is made of metal and there are minimal plastic areas as well. It does seem to blend in pretty well. It doesn't obviously look like a cheap budget case. In general, I think it does look pretty smart. All the areas are neatly finished, everything's neatly painted black, there's no sort of weird unfinished or sharp areas, and I think that you get two big tempered glass panels, and I do think the RGB fans are pretty high quality as well. The actual chassis itself, it seems like you're paying like 30 quid for it, so for 30 quid I think it is pretty good. I just really hope those fans are worth the extra 56. So through the power of editing, we're going to jump forward in time. I'm going to get some components installed in this case, and then we can talk about what it was like to build in and how well it performs. I've now got all of my components installed in the TOR Pro PC case, and as you can see, it is all lit up. Here is a list of all the components that I used in this build. As you can see, the fans are now lit up, and I didn't install any additional fans in the case. I simply used the Edge 14 fans that came with it. You get 4 fans. I'm pretty sure that's sufficient for airflow, and I also wanted to test the performance of the case while it was stock without actually adding any additional fans into it. The fans themselves I've left on the sort of default rainbow wave effect, and I must say they do look pretty cool now they are finally all lit up. One thing that I did notice now the RGB lighting is all working is that the tint on the tempered glass on this case is actually pretty intense. The RGB fans are really actually quite bright, but the tint on the tempered glass does take out quite a lot of that brightness. I do quite like that effect though. I think it's more of a subtle approach to the RGB lighting. You can obviously still see it, but it doesn't create too much extra sort of blinding light in the room, and you haven't got this kind of like crazy glow distracting you from what's on your monitor. Also, the bonus of the tint is that I haven't really used very attractive components inside this case. The RAM looks really nice and shines out brightly, but it kind of hides the rest of the components, so if you kind of got a bit of a mismatch, I think it does definitely help with the overall aesthetic. Also with this case, it does look a lot better now that it's got the RGB components all lit up. I think it does create a nice effect because the base design of the case is pretty plain, it's pretty basic, but now it does have more of a unique look thanks to the square kind of RGB fans. Like I mentioned earlier on at the start of the video, the Edge 14 fans that come with this case do come in at a price of about £14. So for me, I think that's about right for the price of these fans. They're not quite as high quality as something like the LL120s from Corsair, but they do have just the same amount of lighting effects and they come in at the same brightness. So basically the lighting that you get from them is just as good, and you get slightly a more unique shape as well. The lighting can be controlled using a remote. This is my favourite way to control the fans because you don't have to mess around with software. You can have pretty much full control over the RGB lighting just using the remote, and you have got a lot of different options. So you can change between the different kind of modes, the preset modes that come with the case. You can change between kind of like your primary colours, your red, your green, or your blue kind of static colours. You can also switch between a whole host of different modes as well. So there's the static colours, you've got kind of wavy ones, you've got like breathy ones and spinny ones and flashy ones. There is a whole host of different effects to choose between. My favourite is the rainbow wave. You can also kind of hold as well. You can pause the effect if you wanted to. And I think that the remote gives a whole load of control. Also with the remote, it seems to have a pretty good range as well. So if you're someone that likes to watch movies from on your PC from the other side of the room, you want to turn the lighting off so that you can not have any distractions, that's obviously going to come in handy. That does actually have pretty good range on it. The effects can also be changed by pressing the LED button on the front of the case. This is slightly more randomized as you can only kind of cycle through all the different effects and things. And also one little issue I found is that the LED button is exactly the same as the reset button. So with this being a tool case, it's quite easy to kind of reach up and feel around for it, but don't do that because I did accidentally reset the PC while I was trying to change the lighting effects. I've now taken the tempered glass side panel off this case so we can take a look at the components that I've got inside. I must say I prefer the look of the case with that side panel on because the tint effect does really hide the mismatch of components that I've got inside. So when it came to building in the case, I must say in general it went pretty smoothly. There were a few things that I wasn't a fan of, but I didn't find any major issues. When it came to installing the motherboard, I did have to install an additional 3 standoffs, which I don't really like to do because it is a bit pain. It adds a bit of time to building in the case. For some reason the pre-installed standoffs that they'd used were set up for an ITX motherboard. It doesn't make too much sense in a full tower size case, as you're probably more likely to put a full size motherboard in, but I mean it's only kind of a picky thing really. The motherboard itself went into place really easily. There's plenty of space to maneuver in this case. Being a full tower size, it's obviously slightly more generous with the space you have in general. I also had no problems installing the GPU. Once again, plenty of space to get it into place. You've actually got a really large amount of room if you wanted to install a really long graphics card in this case. The PCIe slots come off really easily. I just had to use a screwdriver and then I could take both of them out the case. And also if you wanted to install a tall CPU cooler, you've got a decent amount of clearance as well. So I've now flipped the case around so we can take a look at how I found installing things around the back here and cable managing it, etc. So installing the SSD was pretty easy because it's just a case of taking off that bracket. It comes off with one screw and then you can screw the SSD in and outside the case and then put it back into place. It's got a really good amount of clearance for installing the SATA cables as well. I also removed the other brackets as well, so there was a couple of hard drive brackets there if you remember, and then an SSD bracket. I removed those just to make a little bit more room for the cables. When it came to installing the power supply, I was a little bit annoyed really. It's not because it was difficult to install, it's very simple to get the power supply in the top of the case behind the PSG shroud, get it screwed in, there's plenty of room in that. But unfortunately I don't really like the orientation. Because the way the case works, the screws alignment on the back of the case, you can only put the power supply in one direction, and that direction is with the fan facing into the case, so it's intaking warm air from the other components. I always like to position my power supply so it can intake fresh air from outside the case, so that did slightly annoy me, but fortunately it does mean that it's not going to be intaking air that has isn't dust filtered, because the vents alongside here don't have a dust filter on them, so with the power supply orientated that way, it means that it's getting air that's been filtered by the dust filters on the case. Plugging in all the cables to connect up the components was pretty straightforward really. There was a well positioned slot for the 24 pin, there was lots of clearance at the top of the motherboard to get the 8 pin into place, and the slot for the I/O cables was really well positioned as well. However, with the I/O cables I did find them to be actually pretty short. You have to be rather thoughtful where you route them in order for them to actually reach the bottom of the motherboard. For me, I think that maybe AEROCOOL have used a generic front I/O, and they forgot to take into account this is a full tower size case, so there's a lot of distance from the top of the case to the bottom of the motherboard, and those cables need to be a little bit longer so you can route them nicely and make sure they still reach. So for me, I did find them a little bit short, and you do have to be quite aware of what you're doing with them, otherwise something like the audio cable just isn't going to reach. Once all of my components were installed in the case, I got round to doing my cable management. So I was still slightly irritated that I had to use a Molex cable in this case, and I did use a whole load of cable ties in order to get everything tied down. One thing that did annoy me though, even though I did feel like I tied the cables down quite well, is that the side panel was still really awkward to get into place. There's quite a lot of flex to it, so when you go to put it on against the cables kind of push against it and it kind of warps it, and then also you have to kind of slot it into these slots at the top and the bottom, and then also slot it into this edge here, and I did find like I was fighting with it quite a bit. I felt like maybe I hadn't even cable managed the case at all, because it was really awkward to get back on and kind of force those screws back into place. Also in this case as well, I had to be careful with where I routed the cables. Up the top here you can see the cables from the other side. Even though that tempered glass panel is quite tinted, I didn't want to shove too many cables up here, as I really didn't want them to be visible. This PSG shroud, I couldn't really use it as I wanted to, and it meant that I had to kind of route the cables in other places throughout the case, which of course didn't really help with the problems I had with the side panel. So now I'm going to finally move on to how well the AEROCOOL TOR Pro case performs. I'll start off with the results of my acoustic testing. While idle, this PC is pretty quiet. I took a reading of 39.1 decibels, so that means you can only really hear the fan noise when you put your head right up next to it. There was a noticeable increase in fan noise to 42.7 decibels when I put the PC under load, but I don't think that's really too loud at all. In general, the Edge 14 fans that come with the case aren't hugely loud fans, so even when the PC is under load, that fan noise does sort of fade into the background and you really can't hear it at all when you have got a headset on. Now for the results of the cooling performance tests that I did on the case. So with this case, I actually included the delta temperature in my results because I had the joys of trying to test it in a heat wave. So my office space was way above the sort of normal 22-ish degrees I get when I'm testing the components. When it came to the idle temperature in this case, I found that it was about 13-14 degrees above the room temperature. So for me, that is about average really. It's sort of what I expect from the components while they're idle. I then tested the components while they were under load. So the CPU got up to 67 degrees and the GPU got up to 79 degrees. I also opted with this case to test the components with the front panel removed. So I removed the front panel and then did the same testing again, and what I actually found is that CPU runs 10 degrees cooler with the front panel removed and the GPU runs 4 degrees cooler, and those aren't really insignificant results. That CPU definitely runs a lot cooler, so it shows that the sort of my suspicions are correct really, and that the front of this case does mean that it has really restrictive airflow because of that tempered glass panel. It obviously helps with the aesthetics, but with this case there is definitely more of an emphasis on aesthetics over having really good airflow performance. So overall, when it comes to the TOR Pro PC case from AEROCOOL, I must say in general, I don't think this case is too bad if you're someone that wants a lot of RGB lighting and some tempered glass and things. You're looking for an attractive case to put your components in, but you don't want to splash too much cash on buying the nice case and the RGB fans and things separately. With the TOR Pro, it does come as all sort of like one bundle. You're getting a full tower size chassis and some really nice RGB fans, and in total I do think that's probably worth the £88 you're going to pay for it. However, because of that you do get a few weird quirks. So I don't really like the PSU shroud. I'm also not a huge fan that if you install a radiator it's got to go in off center in this case. The I/O cables are also a bit on the short side and the dust filter is pretty poor quality as well. Also when it comes to airflow, it is quite restrictive in this case, and any components that you put in it are going to run a little bit warmer than they would do with a case that's more focused on airflow with a mesh front or something like that. This case, it looks good but maybe doesn't perform as well as other cases available on the market. If you like this video from KitGuru, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more from KitGuru, make sure to hit the subscribe button. There's also a bell icon you can press as well. That will give you a notification every time a new video goes live. We like to say thank you to all of our Patreons on Patreon. We're trying to run some more events and things to do sort of like giveaways and that to give back to the people that are helping to support KitGuru. If you want to support KitGuru in other ways as well, we also have a Discord channel you can join, and we also have a merch store as well where you can pick up one of our lovely KitGuru t-shirts.